some voice exercises.
Welcome to the Speaking Your Lingo podcast, where my goal is to help this generation think well. My name is Shane Lingo, and today I'm joined by my good friend, Gavin Knickerbocker. Gavin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing awesome. I'm real excited to be here, and this is definitely a first for me, so I'm excited to jump in and see where this takes us.
Love it. Well, I'm super excited to have you on the show, and I know we've been planning this conversation for a good while now, and it's finally happening. And so for those of you that are listening today, this should be a pretty interesting conversation because we're talking about something we've never discussed on the show before. I don't even know if we've even gotten anywhere close to this. This should be fun because today we're going to be talking all things aliens. So without further ado, let's jump in. So Gavin, just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this whole alien business, where you're from. We just want to learn more about you.
Sweet. Well, I hate to break it to you. I am not an expert on this subject by any means, but I'd say just a little bit of background on how I got into this subject. I was living with my buddy around 2019, 2020. We were in college, just kind of bored and stuff. We get home after class, just get curious about things. And he kind of put me onto this whole ancient civilizations thing. And we kind of got into that whole thing and researching all these different cultures that existed and seemed to have these odd similarities and whatnot. And then one day he tells me about this podcast that Joe Rogan had with this Navy pilot. His name was David Fravor. And I listened to that and it was super compelling. And ever since that, I've pretty much just been hooked.
You've been all in.
Yep,
Love it.
Yep,
love it.
Yep.
And you're from Nevada, right?
Correct.
Born and raised,
Yep,
lived there your
Nevada.
whole life until you moved to Utah.
Yep.
And so I guess it makes sense that you are into aliens because when I think about Nevada, it's kind of like the alien capital of the United States. Would you think that's
it seems
true?
like it. It definitely seems like it. There's a lot of odd cases and let's just say coincidences that seem to happen in Nevada. It's definitely a strange place, that's for sure.
Yeah, you think of you have Area 51, you have, I don't know, there's just something like a lure to the area.
Yeah.
They have the Nevada test site close to there.
Yep, Nellis.
Yeah.
Everything.
I mean,
It's
maybe
odd.
all these aliens are just like people who were, affected by all these nukes and they're just, maybe it's something like that. I don't know. But
It could be. We can get into that.
love it. And you say you're not an expert, but I think you said,
No.
You've been abducted like 6 times.
Oh, yeah, I wish. No, I'm kidding. I do not wish. That would be honestly one of my biggest fears. This is something where when I first got into it, I was like, oh man, I'd love to come face to face with an alien. I'd love to see a UFO up close. I'd love to get abducted and just see what that's like. And the more I've thought about it and the more that I've gotten into these stories and read into it, what people's actual experiences are, it seems just utterly terrifying. And I don't think I would handle that well whatsoever. So it is now one of my biggest fears, but for some reason the curiosity just gets to me and I just can't put this topic away for some reason.
Awesome. Well, Answer this for a sec. Do you remember the moment you became convinced that aliens might be real? Tell us what happened.
I feel to be honest with you, I don't know that there was ever just a snapshot moment where I was okay, I'm all in. I feel it was a slow skepticism into just extreme curiosity into just I don't think I can deny that there's a there, and there's definitely something going on. But I feel I'm still not completely convinced of the overall truth or what the overall, outline of everything is. I think that there's a lot of piecing things together and just things that seem to fit into the right boxes, but there's just a box that the shape doesn't quite make sense yet, I feel like.
So if you were to give a percentage, okay, so aliens are real. They're out there. They're a sure thing to not at all. What percentage do you think you would say that aliens are real?
I mean, I'm compelled to say 100%,
Wow,
but I feel like
okay.
that's a little bit of a leap. So I'm gonna say conservatively 95%. I feel there's a chance that we're being psyoped and there's something odd going on here, but there's a very strong chance that something's been here. And something's been here a while. That's kind of how I'd put it. And I don't know quite what to say it is. I feel aliens is a very loaded term and extraterrestrial is a very loaded term. And we've got this new term.
I'm not using the right language. You got to
We've got another
inform
one.
me.
We've got another one, non-human intelligence, that seemed to have popped up recently. So there's too much terminology. All I can say is that there's something there. That's my big thing, I'd say.
All right. Well, I'm kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. Okay. Right. So I'm an alien skeptic. If I was to try to put a percentage on it, I might be like 5% that aliens exist. I don't know if they're real or if they actually exist. And so part of the goal of today's conversation is for you to help convince listeners who are kind of skeptics like me why they should believe aliens exist. And so with that, let me just start with this. Okay. Let's dive into this, especially again, for those who are like the skeptics like me, like aliens don't exist. This is crazy. This is another conspiracy theory. What do you think is the most compelling piece of evidence out there?
Interesting question. I think that there's a lot of interesting evidence out there, and I've got a giant list in front of me of different cases, different just events that have happened, different people, different experiences, all sorts of stuff. I feel like I lean towards the case that kind of got me into all this, which was the USS Nimitz encounter with David Fravor and Commander Alex Dietrichs, and I feel like there was somebody else involved. But those are the big names. If you look those names up, if you look up the USS Nimitz, you can find all the information on this stuff. But I can kind of give you the rundown of the case. Basically, I believe it was 2004, off the coast of California. We've got an aircraft carrier called the USS Nimitz. There's a group of fighter pilots who are extremely well trained. Commander David Fravor is a Top Gun pilot, like legitimately one of our best pilots in the fleet at the time. They're off doing some exercises right off the aircraft carrier, and they get vectored into a position where they were getting some weird radar contacts. So they get sent out to this location. They've got, I believe, 2 planes in the air. It was David Fravor in the front seat of his plane, Alex Dietrich in the back seat of that plane, and then there was another plane involved, but we don't really know exactly who those people are. I'm guessing because they're still enlisted. But basically what they say is they get to this point, and they're flying over this point that they get sent to, and they see this weird washing in the water, like white caps, and it seemed like something was kind of like what they say is broiling below the surface is the terminology that they tend to use.
Okay, like the water's like boiling,
kind of like bubbling up, and just like white water. It's just like when you're out on the ocean. I've never been out on the ocean in a fighter plane, so I can't say myself, but I can imagine when you're out on the ocean, it's pretty like just blue, and you might get like a white cap here and there, and you might see like a whale breach or something, and that might catch your attention, I would imagine. But when you have,
but they're saying this is something different, like the water,
yes,
like more than just like a whale like popping up, 100%. Coming to the surface, because you would see some movement and some things like that. They're describing something different.
Exactly, totally different, totally foreign. And I've heard him use the term of like a mothership or like a docking ship under the water is kind of what he like, not his immediate thought, but now that he's had time to kind of look back at the incident, that's kind of how he described it. But he's got this giant patch of water. I can't remember the size that they said it was, but there's tons of information out there on this topic. And I encourage your listeners to go out and look into this case, because it is absolutely fascinating and so much evidence behind it. You've got multiple modalities of evidence, and it's just incredibly interesting. So they see this little, like, we'll just call it a swell of water, a strange anomaly in the water, if you will. And they start to lose some elevation to get down and kind of check out what's going on. And as they do that, they see this smaller object kind of hovering above it and moving super radically. It's going forwards and backwards and side to side and up and down, and just kind of like almost looks like it's glitching over the water and doing some really weird stuff. And they notice that, they get lower. And as they get lower, he's kind of coming in on like almost like a spiral pattern around this object and kind of losing some altitude going that way.
So is he like in a fighter jet at this point? Okay.
Exactly. So he's in his fighter jet, kind of circling around this object and losing some altitude, almost doing like a corkscrew around it and kind of towards the water. And as he does that, this object shoots up and matches his exact movements. And then he starts going up as this comes up, and they just do like a merry-go-round, kind of like checking each other out and just doing this weird stuff. I can't remember exactly what happens from that point, but at a certain point, it just like shoots off, and they're like, "Okay, that was weird. Don't really know what to make of that." And they get vectored back to a different point. They had another point that's called their cap point, which is kind of like their regroup point, and they kind of circle around, kind of get back in formation, head to that point. All of a sudden, on radar, this thing pops up again. At this point, that's completely undisclosed to anybody. besides the fighter pilots and the controllers on the aircraft carrier, this thing pops up on radar. And then as they get there, I can't remember if they saw it or not, but it just shoots off again. And that's that.
And that was the end of it.
Yep. And there's tons of footage of this that you can find online, which is really compelling.
Oh, so there's actually videos.
Yes, there's videos, radar evidence. We have infrared sensors. We've got the actual eyewitness testimony. There is ample evidence of this case. It's actually a case that the U.S. Navy officially released. The Pentagon actually came out and released all this information on this case because it was kind of leaking out, and they just kind of wanted to set the story straight. So this is a case that is from our government. This is not like a sketchy leak or anything like that. You have these Top Gun trained pilots that will talk about this story night and day. And I think that is one of the most compelling cases out there as far as that has a lot of evidence to back it. And I encourage everybody listening to check that case out because it is fascinating.
So these pilots, like, they were convinced themselves that this is some sort of alien activity.
I mean, I don't
like what did like. I'm curious how many people saw it, and then is that what they think it was? I mean, do they assume it was something like that?
Yeah. So from my understanding, it sounds like at the very least there was the two of them that saw it, which were both in the same plane. There was the pilot and then his co-pilot who absolutely saw it. They both talk about it. And the impression that I get and the kind of the story that they put across is there was another plane with them, or at least a couple other planes with them, who presumably also saw it.
Okay.
But we have at least the two people in the plane's testimony, and we have the radar operators from the aircraft carrier. We have the infrared evidence from their cameras, their actual like gun pods on the fighter plane. And we also have like the footage from that.
Okay.
So
wow,
it's incredible.
All
Very
right.
interesting case. And to answer your other question about what they thought it was, they don't really go as far as to say like, oh, this is alien or whatever else. And honestly, I wouldn't even go that far as to say that, but it's definitely something anomalous. It's something that we don't officially have in our military arsenal, or if you will. And it's certainly not something that we would have expected any of our adversaries to have either. I mean, this was 2004.
Okay.
Right before, or kind of leading up to the whole Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, that whole Middle East conflict, if you will. So it's not like we had like the most advanced tech out there. The F-22 was still in development, and I just don't think you could say that it was confidently anything that we should have. And there's a big asterisk there.
Okay.
There's a very big asterisk there.
Yeah, because it's kind of hard because my brain goes towards, it sounds interesting, sounds like, and for me, I've never looked into this, so I have a
Sure.
lot more research to do on the other end of this.
Sure.
But was it, could it be something that's explained in other ways, like another government's ship? You know what I mean? Like another government sent something out and now...
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it was
yeah.
a part of that. I mean, a lot of questions go through my head, but it is one piece of evidence that could lead to, I'm sure, some sort of cumulative case, especially when we bring in some more of these different sightings and things. But if people want to find more information on this, where can they look?
So originally the story broke by the New York Times in 2017, and it's kind of what blew the lid on this whole topic, like more or less officially. And it kind of forced the Pentagon to come out and release all these videos. And for people curious, this is the USS Nimitz case with Commander David Fravor and Alice Dietrich. And it was, like I said, this was in 2004. And the craft that they saw is commonly referred to as the Tic Tac. And so for people curious, I would look up, USS Nimitz Tic Tac case, and you'll be able to find a plethora of information on it.
Awesome. Well, let me ask this. Have you ever actually seen an alien before yourself?
Fortunately, I have not seen an alien myself. Kind of like we touched on earlier, I am terrified to come face to face with an alien. I've seen some odd things in the sky, but nothing I could attribute whatsoever to a UFO or even anything of the likes. So I can confidently say I, at least knowingly, have not come face to face with an alien. So
like when I think about aliens, I'm trying to picture like, what do you think they look like? Like, for example, I just introduced my girls to the Men in Black movies, right? So that was their first experience with aliens was Men in Black. And I know that those movies played a big part in my childhood. Mm-hmm. So how close to reality is Men in Black, I guess, is what I'm asking. Like, there's a couple key scenes, you know. Yeah. I mean, there's the cockroach dude who's unforgettable. Is it something like that? And they like take on human suits and whatnot, and then it turns into this big, giant, ugly like monster thing. Mm-hmm. Or I think the most compelling one is, you know, when they're in the they're in like a morgue, I think is what it is, and they have the dead body, and then the dude's face opens up, and there's the little
guy
dude
controlling it.
Yeah, and he's inside the brain. Is it more like that? Like, what are we looking at here?
So touch on the Men in Black movie first. I would say there is definitely some truth to that movie. As far as, especially, I don't know if you remember like the very opening scene of the movie, and I might be totally getting this wrong because it's been a while since I watched that movie. But the opening scene of the movie opens up with like a crash. If I'm not wrong, I don't know why I stumbled there. And you have like this sort of hazmat team show up, and they're kind of like recovering all this stuff, and it's all under wraps. And you got these guys in suits that come up, and anybody that was kind of involved, they're just like, okay, you didn't see anything. And then they flash them. So as far as the things that are incorrect about that, I don't think we have a little device that can delete your memory with a flash. That's for sure.
I was hoping you were going to say that's the real part. That's the...
I would say the other part that's probably not true is I don't think the guys specifically are just walking around in black tuxedos. But there definitely is a group of people who are specifically assigned to these, what is now considered crash retrievals, is what it's commonly referred to now. And there's definitely some strange cases of people called Men in Black. It's not much like they're kind of portrayed in the movie, but there's a weird... almost urban legend, if you will, of these Men in Black characters, especially with people who have had encounters and contact with aliens. People showing up in the middle of the night, acting super strange, wanting to know more information, wanting to keep people quiet. And that's something that people can look into on their own. I think that's getting a little too in the weeds for this particular juncture. But
it does kind of make me question, like, how much do you think of this is covered up by the government? Like, how much of this is due to government secrecy, and maybe they have way more information than we know of, than we think of, and they don't want to share it with the general public? I mean, you have Area 51 and all of that, and who knows what's going on with that whole place. And so, how much of this do you think the government knows? Do you think they have way more information and they're choosing not to give it to us? Like,
it's a tricky one. I'd say they definitely know way more than they're ever letting on. But to be naive to think that they know exactly what's going on, I think is also definitely not the case. You have people like Christopher Mellon, who is basically like a Pentagon correspondent, more or less, and he's super tied in with the Pentagon and kind of the black budget world of kind of the United States government. And he lets on that we've got a lot of stuff, a lot of very compelling evidence that just probably isn't ever going to see the light of day. And if it does, it's going to be way watered down. You've got people like Lou Elizondo, who is a whistleblower from a former UFO research program under the Pentagon called, I believe he was working under ATIP, which was the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And he says things like, we've got crystal clear satellite footage, we've got crystal clear USS carrier deck footage, we've got crystal clear gun camera footage from our fighter planes, and all sorts, like, among other more physical pieces of evidence, and we can touch on that as well. But it's a tough question to answer. Obviously, I don't work in the government, and I'm not an insider, so unfortunately, I don't have any inside scoop. But from what I've researched, the government definitely knows way more than we ever will, but I don't think that they know the truth quite yet.
Okay. Well, let's say the government finally declassified everything. Like, if you just had to guess or, try to think about it, like, what do you think we would find out?
I think we would find out some very, very, very interesting things. I think that, like, the first thing that comes to mind is the consciousness aspect of this whole thing. There's a very recent whistleblower. His name is Jake Barber, who's come out and talked about what is referred to now as the psionics programs that we are running. And essentially there's people that are able to I'm going to use the wrong terminology here, but just to make it easier for your listeners to kind of understand what's going on, is essentially are able to telepathically communicate and vector in and control some of these UFOs. And it's a very interesting overlap with some other very interesting things that are going on right now. There's this new podcast, if you will. It's called the Telepathy Tapes. It's more or less just like an audio documentary as for what's going on. And these kids that are severely autistic are able to telepathically communicate with their moms and their dads and people in their lives. And they've done all sorts of experiments to like triple blind, super like practically in a Faraday cage, run tests on these kids, and they can telepathically communicate and understand what's going on in their parents' minds and other people's minds. And it's actually fascinating. And I would encourage people that are listening to look that up. It's called the Telepathy Tapes. And there's this weird overlap with that. There's a very strange consciousness aspect to this whole phenomenon. And I think that would be something that would be very strange to find out if all the doors were blown off. And so like everybody kind of knows like the Stranger Things story. And a big part of that is true. Like the whole mind control, these gifted kids that are kind of brought into these programs and used as what is referred to as psionic assets for all sorts of things. There's a remote viewing aspect to this whole thing, which is a whole different topic, but very interesting. And so to answer your question, I think the second side of this would be very interesting. I think that
I have to pause for a second. You just dropped a lot on me right there.
Fair enough.
I'm picturing X-Men, and that's a lot. And you know, as a bit of a skeptic, I'm like, yeah. So this brings up a whole nother realm of what someone like me would consider the conspiracy world.
Sure.
But conspiracies in the past have been shown to be true, so I don't just write them off because of that. But the telepathy thing, like that's a lot. Like
it's fascinating. And so you have these kids. I can't remember the name of the lady who kind of ran all the experiments, but just to kind of give people a rundown, you'd have these, like I said, there's these severely autistic kids who are completely nonverbal, and what she would do is she would run some tests. She would have the kid in a completely different room, completely isolated. Obviously didn't have like a way of communicating with the mom, and the mom would be thinking of something or shown something, and the kid would either be able to like draw what she was thinking, write out what she was thinking, say in a way what she was thinking or seeing. And this was not just with like an isolated kid or group of kids. This is kids all over the world. This is from kids that are in the United States, in Asia, and Europe, and Africa, all over the world that expressed this ability to essentially be telepathic. And it is absolutely fascinating.
Interesting. And so that kind of brings up when you bring up like all of these other countries and nations, because I mean, maybe I could buy into the fact that our government could hide all of this information on UFO and aliens, but it's hard for me to believe any conspiracy or what I would call conspiracy that would say all of the governments of the world are in on this and they all agree and they're hiding information on it. So, and I don't know how much you've looked into this, but like, are there other countries that have come out with information that have played a big part on this, or videos or whatever, especially since our world is so interconnected nowadays, like across the internet, you can get anything. So are there other like countries who have spoken to this? And
so I'll kind of touch on the first part of your question as far as like, how could this be coordinated and kept secret from everybody?
Okay.
Think back to like when we were in the Manhattan Project era, where the Germans were working on nuclear devices, the Soviets were working on nuclear devices, and we were also working on nuclear devices. And it's not like any of them were communicating. It's not like any of them were trying to show their cards as far as what they knew and what they didn't know, and kind of the gaps in their security, if you will, their national security. So I think this is very similar to that. And it's been going on just about as long as that project was happening, if not longer. Again, another thing we can touch on, but
But
I mean,
but it seems like that stuff, when we look at the Manhattan Project, like
sure.
that stuff eventually leaked out. And it's like, we as the general public know it was an atomic bomb.
Well, I mean, I think it leaked out because so overtly we dropped a couple of them. And I think had that not happened, I think that this would still more or less probably be under wrap and key until they actually had to show their hands. And so I think it's very similar to that. Once again, I'm not a government insider. I don't know everything that all the governments knows. But to touch on the second part of the question, absolutely, we are far and away not the only country that experiences this phenomenon, especially within our government. The Soviets certainly had their fair share of files, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of those files kind of leaked out. And there's a famous journalist, George Knapp, who is famous in this topic and in this realm of UFOs. And he broke the Bob Lazar story, for those that are familiar with that story, which I have my own opinions on, but that's neither here nor there. George Knapp actually went to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union and recovered a lot of those files straight from, like, I don't know what, like the Kremlin vault or whatever their kind of like CIA is. And he recovered a bunch of these verified files that talk about the programs they were using to research these things, a bunch of their different cases, a bunch of their different, theories and just the issues they kind of had with it. And famously, JFK and I think it was Khrushchev at the time.
That sounds right.
I'm not great with my history, but at the time of the Cold War and everything, it was like they were kind of had an agreement of like, if we got attacked by aliens, more or less, like, would you have our back? And this is a verified conversation that went on between the two. And they came to the conclusion of like, yeah, absolutely.
You can find this? Like this was,
this was 100%.
This must've been after we were more practicing like accommodation, working together kind of during that season. We were selling them wheat and we were working together. Is just to bring this in. I mean, is this why Kennedy was assassinated? Don't tell me that.
I don't think it's quite overtly why he was assassinated. I think there was maybe some things going on there. I think that Kennedy knew a little bit too much and wanted to change a little bit too many things in a lot of different aspects. I don't think it was just in regards to like UFOs and that aspect of our national security, but I think that just some of the things he wanted just didn't sit quite right with people. But again, that's kind of neither here nor there.
I mean, I don't want to go too far down the Kennedy road, but we had all of those documents just released, and I've been, reading up and listening to some historians who have looked into the documents, and it seems like at this point we haven't found out much more information.
No, unfortunately not.
There does seem to be a decent amount of evidence, and maybe a little bit more evidence to point towards the fact that there could have been another shooter.
100%, yeah.
Like it wasn't just Lee Harvey Oswald and there was another person out there, whether they were on the grassy knoll or wherever they took another shot.
Yep.
And I think it had to do something with the fact that the type of gun that he had and how quickly he could get off a shot and load it and all of those things, it was probably more. So there is definitely conspiracy there. It's going to be a jump for me to connect that to aliens.
And me too.
Like, I don't know if I can connect it there, but I mean, the CIA involvement, all of that, absolutely. I think is for sure plausible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have the magic bullet theory that they tried to float for a while, which I don't know who in their right mind would buy that whole theory, but there's just a lot of holes in the official explanation of that story. And personally, I don't think it had quite anything to do with UFOs, but Kennedy certainly didn't know nothing about the topic. I'll just say that.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay. So as a skeptic, this is the thing I think about, right? You're telling me we have these highly intelligent, more intelligent than us as human beings, aliens. For some reason, they want to come and check out Earth all the time. Okay. And they're crashing all over the place and getting caught. And yet they're super intelligent. Like, figure that out. Like, help me figure that out.
Yeah,
like, you know what I mean? Like, highly
Well,
intelligent life force comes to Earth for whatever reason, checks things out, flies around, gets caught. Sometimes they crash. I mean, I don't know if I can buy it.
Okay. Well, there's a few things to touch on here, and I feel like we should probably take it one at a time because these are all like, once again, these are all things we could do like deep dives on just in themselves. But we'll just start off with like, they're this intelligent thing, and for some reason they want to check out Earth, right? Well, we can see obviously that there's not a ton of Earth-like planets to begin with. There's not a ton of planets that could seed the kind of life that we see here on Earth, between all the plant life and animal life and fungal life and all this strange life that is just absolutely abundant on this planet. We do not see that, certainly nowhere in our solar system. And even as we look past our solar system, that's not something we see to even tend to find even Earth-like planets, let alone planets that seem to have signatures that would indicate, carbon-based life. So I think just on that point alone, I think the Earth is super interesting. And I don't quite like that explanation of like, why would they have any interest in us? We're just like dumb. Some people would call us intelligent apes. I don't think we're just simply intelligent apes, but I don't think that we're uninteresting by any stretch of the imagination. I think that we are incredibly interesting. I think that what is going on this planet is incredibly interesting, especially when you look at the conflicts that go on this planet and the strange tribalism that goes on this planet. I think all of that would be super interesting to whatever intelligent, complex life is out there. And the second part of that, if they're this intelligent thing, like how are they crashing? How is this all happening, right? So a couple prevailing theories here, and I'm just going to kind of throw some things at you real quick.
All right.
We don't know that what we're seeing is quite the colloquial alien that we would be talking about, this perfectly sentient, intelligent being that has its own ambition and its own, let's just say, enterprise, if you will, right? Like a leading theory is that a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of these little gray guys, right? Because that's kind of the common sighting of an alien is this little gray guy. And a lot of explanations I've seen for that is that they're simply just like more or less a biological AI. And they're essentially these little robots that are just here to like do essentially like a higher being's kind of dirty work, if you will. And I hate the way I'm putting this, but that's kind of like one of the prevailing theories.
So I would think they would have some sort of like mind, some sort of intellect and reasoning capacities, similar, I guess, to that of humans. But I guess what you're saying is there is something like that, but it's not 100%. What we're seeing. It's behind these little robots, if you will, that they're sending down. They're sending drones.
That seems to be sort of the
explanation. They're sending drones to us to check us out.
Yep.
They're not sending the real deal.
Well, because I mean, if you had the ability to essentially create like an avatar of yourself to go explore this foreign planet with these violent humans that can't figure out how to just like chill out. I mean, I wouldn't just go plop myself down there and be like, hey guys, can we figure this out? Like, there's no way, So I think that there's definitely like a logic to that theory and that way of explaining this topic in a way. I don't think that covers all of the ground on this topic, though. I think that that's a compelling theory. And again, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm just kind of throwing theories at you and throwing some of my research at you and whatnot. And then I want to touch on like why they crash, right? You would think that these super advanced, let's call them spacecraft, they're a lot more than spacecraft from what we've seen. They are completely transmedium. We've seen these things in the air, we've seen them in space, we've seen them underwater, and frankly, we've even seen them go through mountains, like solid matter. We've seen them travel through. And so the question is like, why are they crashing? If they're so advanced, if they're so complex, how do they get into our planet after presumably traveling across the solar system or across the universe to get here? How are they crashing? I think that there's a couple of explanations for that tend to hold some weight for me. One of those being the first time we've seen these crash was around the time that we first started experimenting with radar and radios and these strange electromagnetic waves that we manipulate as humans to communicate and as weaponry and as all sorts of things that we do with electromagnetic radiation and all the like. I think that a simple explanation for that is that they're just not used to that. I mean, that's not something you would naturally find occurring on any planet, is all this electromagnetic interference and anomalies and all that kind of stuff. So that's a certain explanation that definitely holds some ground for me, is we started seeing these things drop out of the sky when we first started turning on high power radar and high power radios and started testing nuclear warheads and all sorts of stuff like that. So that certainly holds some ground for me. Another thing that holds some ground, and this is going to get way into the weeds, but I'm just going to throw it out there because I think it's important for people to be able to look into or just ponder, if you will. And it's this idea of a scalar weapon and a scalar wave. And essentially what it is an electromagnetic wave, or our typical radio wave, is an actual wavelength. It travels through our atmosphere at a set speed and at a set frequency, and it's relatively predictable. These scalar means of communication are nothing like that. They are completely quantum, and it is essentially like a beeline wave, but it's not a wave, it's just a line. So you can picture this as just like a signal that travels on a trajectory of a straight up line rather than being a wave, and is quantum based, so it doesn't actually like transverse through space and time. It's just point to point, which is, again, super experimental, and there's not a ton of information out there on that, but there's a lot of people that will touch on that in this, we'll call it this UFO field. And that seems to be a huge interference with these craft, and seems to be a strange connection with them. I'll just say that.
Okay.
And so once again, very in the weeds. I don't know that we really need to touch on all that, but just something to throw out there for the listeners and for the people that really do want to look into this stuff.
I like it. So let me ask this. As a Christian, okay, do you think that God created aliens? And I'm assuming maybe that's the direction you would go as a Christian who believes in aliens. And I'm sure there are a lot of Christians who do believe in aliens. Why didn't he include them in the Bible? Why don't we know about them? Is that what you think happened? Like, how do you connect your faith as a Christian to also your faith in aliens?
Yeah. Great question. And I really like this question because I think it gets tossed around, and people kind of like obfuscate this question and turn it into something that it absolutely shouldn't be. Plain and simple, like, absolutely. I do think that God created aliens and created all of the intelligent life and all of the unintelligent life that's in the entire universe, like, plain and simple. As far as why he didn't include them in the Bible, I think that you could answer that a few different ways. I think that first off, like, while the Bible is, we'll just call it, and I might butcher my terminology here, the way that I'm wording this, but the Bible is essentially supremely created through the inspiration of God himself, right? That's kind of the way that we look at the Bible. And it is not written solely by God. It is written by humans through the inspiration of God for the purpose of humans. And so looking at it from that lens, I think that there's really no reason for him or them to include aliens or other intelligent life in the Bible. And in that same vein, there's no place in the Bible that specifically states or doesn't state whether other intelligent life is out there. And I think that's kind of for a reason. That's kind of how I look at that whole thing. And there's just, I don't know, if I was God and I was creating these humans, which I will never be, I could never put myself in those shoes. But as a human trying to put myself in those shoes, I just don't know why I would feel the need to talk about that or put that in there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting on a couple fronts to kind of speak to a couple things that you hit on. Like, we do know that there are other intelligent life forces, if you will, in the sense that there's angels and things that are outside of humanity that actually have an intellect, can think, and can interact with us and interact with God, and even make moral decisions, right? Yeah. In one sense. And so, you know, I can't say I know how all that works out, but when we read about angels and you read about, you know, Satan being a fallen angel and some of these ideas, so there's obviously this moral realm for them where they can choose good and evil, unlike an animal, right? Which doesn't live in that moral realm. They can't reason. That's what makes animals different from human beings. Right. So we do know there's something similar to human beings that God has created that can interact with human beings in the form of angels, and then on the other side of that, demons. So we know that those are things that are out there. Some would typically say maybe some of all of this that we're seeing is in that realm. Right.
And I wanted to touch on that is there's supposedly a lot of people in the Pentagon and the people that are, you know, high up in this topic as far as our government goes, who are absolutely terrified of this topic because that's a possible explanation for it. And I'm not going to sit here. And like I said, I try not to say like alien, extraterrestrial, all that stuff, because there's a lot of different explanations to this and a lot of different theories that seem to hold weight for me on this. And I don't think it's any one of them. And so that is something I'd like to touch on at some point in this. But I think that's a great point. Like some of this absolutely could be explained by that phenomenon, and then it might be angels and demons, and that's just as terrifying as if it was aliens to me.
Okay, so interesting. So you're open to that being an explanation, and I think I would be more open to that being an explanation, just because I already have good reason to believe that that's a reality. Whereas aliens, I just need more evidence in order to trust that. Right?
Sure.
Like, just the same reason that I feel like there's great evidence to trust in the historical reliability of the Bible. To trust in the historical reliability of Jesus being raised from the dead. Like that stuff I can get on board with because I feel like I have this great evidence for, which obviously we don't have time on this episode to go into that whole world as we're talking about this conversation. But I don't feel like I have that same evidence in the realm of what I would consider these, and I know you don't like hearing this word conspiracy. Like I don't have enough evidence to go much further or to have any trust that this is, some sort of a reality, right? That I could follow. And I mean, my only answer to at one point you mentioned like, why would God, bring this up and tell us about it? The only reason I would think so is because of the fact that they clearly have interacted with us if your theory is true.
True, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they have interacted with us. And so why would we need to know? If they were just living there in some other realm or some other universe and there was never going to be contact, then I could say, yeah, we don't need to know as human beings because there's no interaction between us. But if there's going to be, and there has been, some sort of significant interaction between aliens and us, you would think you'd be like, God, like, come on, give me a heads up. Because there's some crazy spaceships flying around the world. And I don't remember this coming into the picture. I don't remember this in the creation story. I don't remember, this in the whole deal with, Moses. Like, I don't remember this when Noah was in the ark and the world was flooded. Anyways, so I mean, there's just tons of questions, and obviously you don't have to answer all of that. But
I think it's interesting, and it's definitely something that I kind of go back and forth with and wonder myself. But I just keep coming back to the point of like, it's not explicitly stated or explicitly, stated otherwise that we are the sole intelligent creation of God. And
absolutely.
Personally, I just think it's naive as a human to think that I'm so important that God would tell me that. So that's kind of where I lie in the whole conversation, but it's super interesting. It's a weird juxtaposition, and I don't quite know what to think.
To think that we were made in God's image and he came down in human flesh as Christ to die for us, we're important enough to him. You know what I mean? That'd be my argument, right?
Fair enough.
We are important, but on the other end, I get what you're saying. And the Bible is not meant to be an exhaustive document for us to know everything about life. We don't
100%.
find all of the scientific realities that we found in our modern world written down in the Bible for us. I mean, countless things, what I'm trying to say, are left out of the Bible because it's not meant to be an exhaustive book for us to understand all of reality.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was touching on of like I think it was more written for the way that we as humans and solely humans are supposed to conduct ourselves on this creation that he has made for us, which is Earth. And I think that getting outside the bounds of that is just reading a little too far deep into it and trying to interpret things that just might be beyond us personally.
That's fair.
But it's very interesting. I love the conversation.
Yeah.
It's super interesting.
It's just interesting, right? Trying to mix, we're trying to take our worldview and what we believe and the lens through which we see the world. And then for me, I'm trying to fit this whole other thing into it, which would broaden that worldview if it happened to be true.
Yeah.
And how do we fit all of these pieces together, right? And that's what we do constantly.
One more thing I do want to touch on that specific conversation is that part of the reason I think it's not mentioned is because we would have totally lacked the vocabulary and ways to explain this whole phenomenon entirely. And so I think that it would have been very hard to describe a foreign intelligence, a foreign life on a whole different planet.
Maybe this is what Revelation was talking about.
Fair enough.
I'm only kidding.
So it's interesting. I don't know.
Yeah. If aliens made open contact tomorrow, open contact, they come, we see it, it's on the news, they're trying to communicate with us. how do you think humanity would react? Governments, religions, everyday people? I mean, I know that's a lot, but how's the world reacting to this?
I wish I knew, to be honest with you. And I wish that day would come personally. I think it's super tough because I think there's a lot of people that are comfortable enough in their worldview and in their faith and in the way that they just see the world that it would be something that they could easily grapple and easily wrap their head around. But I think for some people, it would honestly just drive them a little bit mad. And I think
it would completely rock us.
Just decimate everything.
No, I mean, not jumping into the world of like, for me, like, I don't think it would rock my faith. Like I'm open to the reality that there could be other things out there.
Sure.
And if there was overwhelming evidence or I saw the reality of aliens, that doesn't negate, there's nothing in that would contradict Christ being raised from the dead.
Right.
And what I know to be true from history as far as the Bible. So there's nothing there's nothing there that would contradict that. And that's why I would even be open to it. That's why I'm a 5%er. And maybe after this conversation, I'm moving on to 10 and who
I hope
knows,
we get you up to 50.
Yeah,
I really do.
Maybe we'll be 50, but yeah. I don't know what I was saying there, but the fact that, what was I saying there?
Just about like, how would we react as just a civilization?
How would we react? I think we would, like you said, I think it would be like totally go mad. I mean, it would uproot so many things because think about it. We're like so confident in our structures that we have around us that like our government structures, I think our government, our economy, I think all of that could be upended because the security that we have, like even just thinking about our currency, which is this fiat currency, which is all based on our confidence in the American dollar and in our confidence in the government to support that dollar. Does all of that kind of like, I don't know if I feel confident in my government to protect me or to keep these businesses stable or whatever. Now there's a whole nother player in the game. I used to be worried about like these other countries. And now I'm worried about these alien life forces. And I don't even know about the security of our nation. Like, I don't know. I think we'd go mad. Like you said,
I think it's a great point. Cause I mean, imagine that if they just, let's just game theory this. They just touch down on the White House lawn and go, here we are, guys. Like, check us out. I think that everybody would just lose confidence in the government because they've been lying about this for practically like 80 years at this point. And I think that in itself would just be a slap in the face. And I think it would just erode all confidence and among other things. I think it would just be a lot to grapple for a lot of different people. But in the same vein, I think it would be so interesting.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting you say like people would lose confidence in the government and even
more, I guess.
Even more, because what's interesting is like when you go back and you talk about things like the Pentagon Papers, which came out. Yeah. And it showed that, all of these presidents who were involved during the Vietnam era were lying about things and hiding things. And all of that comes out and is leaked out in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And we get all of this information that they were lying and that at that point in time, they couldn't be trusted. And then you get to the Nixon administration and you have the Watergate scandal. And I mean, you just go throughout at least recent history and you look, and there's been so many examples where you couldn't trust the government in multiple areas and in some pretty big areas where they were like blatantly lying to the American people. And then I like to ask people, so when did they start being honest? What was the year after all of these things looking back where it's like the government started being completely honest and we can completely trust that they're giving us all of the correct, true information. And they're not trying to hide anything from us. And it's just kind of an interesting question because
I think it's a great point, honestly. I mean, I don't know how to answer that, but absolutely.
So it's just interesting to think about when you bring the government into it and all of that. Let me ask this. What would you say is the most misunderstood aspect of kind of the UFO alien conversation? What do people like me who are a little bit naive in this world of talking about aliens, like what is most misunderstood?
So a couple of things I've already kind of touched on, which I think are kind of the most understood aspects, and then one kind of bonus that I'm gonna throw at you. The first one would be that psionics, that consciousness aspect of everything. I think that people see this as just simply like they're there, we're here, there's no sort of connection with things. We could never kind of put ourselves in those shoes or get to that same point. And I think that that's a very misunderstood aspect, especially that psionics thing we touched on with that we're just going to call it telepathic control of them. And I think that would be a very misunderstood aspect, because I think people think, if you were to get in a UFO, there'd be, a joystick and a throttle, and you could just kind of move it all around as you please. And the more that comes out about this topic, it seems that this is almost 100% all consciousness based, and you essentially link yourself to these craft, and you are able to pilot them simply with your thoughts and putting yourself in a state, more importantly, that allows you to interface with those craft. And so I think that's one of the big misunderstood aspects, the way I see it. The other one that we touched on is that I don't think that they're all this supremely intelligent, sentient being. I think that a lot of them are more or less a droid, or in any case, just like an AI little robot that's just like a little avatar that gets sent down here to just kind of do the bidding of whatever this intelligent being is that's kind of in charge of these things. So I think that's another misunderstood aspect, and there's a lot of different information that kind of goes both ways on that. And we could also touch on all the different quote unquote types of aliens that seem to be out there. But again, that's getting way in the weeds, and I don't think that's something we quite need to touch on quite yet. And then the other misunderstood aspect is that a lot of people seem to think, and I want to preface this by saying, I don't think that there is any one explanation for all this stuff. I think that there's a plethora of phenomenon that we're seeing that's getting lumped into a very small box. And I think that's a little bit dangerous. So the way I see it is, one of those misunderstood aspects is that these are just space-faring civilizations that have come here and that are curious about us. And I think that there's certainly a possibility and an explanation for that, and it definitely holds weight, and it's definitely probably an explanation for it. But I think on the other end, I think that these could be something that's been here for a very long time, and something that's interacted with humanity for a very long time. Something that could have been almost like an offspring of humans that's kind of gone off and done their own thing and has decided to kind of stick around.
Wait, I got to pause there for a sec. So sorry, but I have to. So you think these possibly could have came from us?
Yes.
Maybe
not so overtly, but
like
maybe
how long ago?
So
they advance more or quicker than us?
Yeah. So it's interesting, and this kind of touches on like what I told you kind of got me into this topic originally, which was the whole ancient civilizations, advanced ancient civilizations, all that kind of stuff, which is its own whole rabbit hole. We don't have to get into all that, but there's definitely something to be said for, there's been technology on this planet that doesn't fit in with our, I'm just going to call it our assembly of history, and definitely sticks out like a sore thumb and just doesn't make sense. For instance, you have all these anomalies in Egypt, and I'm not just talking about the pyramids because that's its own whole thing, but you have these obelisks, and you have these, like the Serapeum, for instance, is super interesting, it's a site in Egypt where you essentially have this underground, I want to call it like a little dungeon lair thing, which is a horrible way to describe it. But you have this little underground little room, if you will, and there's, I believe it's 4 or 5 giant granite boxes. There's something like, I think they're like 20 feet by 15 feet. They're giant, and I'm totally butchering those dimensions, but people can look it up. It's called the Serapeum. And it's these giant granite boxes that are machined absolutely perfectly, to the point that we absolutely could not even recreate these today, even with modern CNC machinery, to the degree of accuracy that these are created. There's also these ancient vases that we see that make zero sense. They have perfect symmetry. They're razor thin, that just, they don't fit into anything. It clearly wasn't made by human hands in the time that we say they were made. And I think there's something to be said for that. I'm not going to go out on a limb and say, oh, that was just like aliens that were here and left, but it's an interesting possibility. And I think at the very least, this was a civilization that maybe was part of humans, maybe wasn't, but has been around, kind of keeping tabs on the planet for a long time, doing all sorts of things.
So a lot of things in history that don't really have a great explanation.
Yeah.
So we can't figure them out. And then there's some things in our modern day that don't have a great explanation. And we look at some of those things and you might say, okay, we don't have any really good explanations for these things. And so maybe this does point towards aliens and
we're kind of glossing over another part of this because this is like a very surface level dive into this, but there's also written accounts of all sorts of strange things. There's accounts from everywhere from Japan to Russia to China to places in Europe to Africa to South America to Indian, like Native American culture that just doesn't fit into anything. And it kind of fits into this box of these ancient advanced, we're going to call them beings that can kind of do things at will. And one of those things that also doesn't fit in among the artifacts that I just talked about is there's this strange similarity across several different cultures around the globe on all sorts of different continents of these big human-like people that touch down with these strange bags. And this sounds so wild, but I want people to look into this if they have a chance. And it's this consistency of this depiction of a human-like person carrying a very similar bag. And it just doesn't make sense. There's not a ton of explanations for it.
And multiple cultures, you're saying.
Multiple cultures, all over the globe.
So some giant being, and they're carrying a bag.
It seems like it. And it's just strange. Like, again, these aren't things that I think hold a ton of weight, but they're just anomalies that seem to kind of connect and fit into this big box that we're creating a small box.
Could this be the Nephilim, from the Bible? Is this like...
All right. Do we want to get into this?
I don't know if we have time for it, but when I hear that, I'm like, it's fun because you think of all of these alternative explanations that could maybe describe or answer the question as to what this is. But I mean, what you think they're aliens or what? I mean,
the Nephilim?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think there's enough information in the Bible to even know what the Nephilim were just single-handedly. And then you get into this whole thing of like the Anunnaki, which is a whole prevalent theory and line of thinking on this topic, more or less. And it's not quite the alien topic, but it's along the lines of this ancient civilization topic. And then that touches on like Atlantis and all this crazy stuff that seems super far out, but there's definitely something there. And I can't say it's like any of it's like vetted or official, and I really can't say much about it, but it's very interesting. It's very compelling, and it just doesn't fit into this framework that we've decided to chop up as our ancient history.
Okay. We got to bring, this is going to take a hard turn, but this is for our listeners. And,
yeah.
Like, how far are you down the conspiracy spectrum? This is going to help us answer this.
Sure.
Like Bigfoot.
I mean, at one point I was like, there's definitely a connection here, but I don't know, the more I look into it, it just seems kind of weird. But that gets into this whole cryptid thing. And that is like, all right, I just want to preface this by saying like this topic can go so many different ways.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of evidence supporting it, and there's a lot of evidence not supporting it in all those different ways. And so that's kind of how I got into this subject, was like looking into weird stuff and then coming to this, and it all seemed to tie into this in a really weird way. All these different conspiracies, all these different anomalies, historical and present day, that just don't seem to fit into a box other than they can be tied to this somehow. And it like I said, it kind of goes both ways, and there's not a ton of water to be held there, but it's super interesting. It's super compelling. And what I wanted to touch on with that, like, or straight off the bat, like, no, I'm not a Bigfoot person, just single-handedly. But I do think that there's weight in this whole cryptid conversation and all that. You have places like Skinwalker Ranch, for instance, out in the Uintas, that is absolutely fascinating and was the subject of government study for something like 20 years under Robert Bigelow, and now under Brandon Fugel. And it's just absolutely fascinating. And those are two names that might perk people's ears up, especially people that live in Utah. Brandon Fugel is like a big real estate developer. You'll see his names on all sorts of buildings across the state. But he acquired this ranch, and there's just constant anomalies on this ranch that are super well documented that just don't quite fit into this alien box, but kind of do in a certain way. and it bridges that
gap. Is this in Utah?
Yeah.
I feel like I've heard about this. Is it down? Where is it at?
It's out in the UNS.
Oh, okay. Oh, you said that. Okay.
I can't remember like the specific area, but it's just south of the UNS. Kind of like,
did he buy the property knowing there was some weird stuff going on with it? Okay.
So originally it was owned by, and this is a real interesting thing, and I would encourage people to look into Skinwalker Ranch because it is super interesting.
What a name, Skinwalker Ranch. What is that? Where does that come from?
So it comes from the native culture.
Okay.
It sits right beneath, and the property kind of sits on this plateau that was originally inhabited by these natives. And they had all these stories of these weird walking, shape-shifting creatures, if you will, that not necessarily haunted them, but kind of haunted them in a way. And I'm probably butchering that. People that are like, native historians or whatever might be like, no. But they had all these different accounts and all these strange stories of these skinwalkers. So that's where it gets its name. And the phenomenon kind of just prevails to present day. And it started off, there was a family that owned it who was ranching on it, and there was all these paranormal aspects to it. And I'm actually reading a book dedicated to this whole Skinwalker Ranch thing right now. There's a family that was living on it. They had all these weird things happening around them, all this paranormal and supernatural stuff happening to them, between like almost ghost-like stuff, almost like weird fantastical beast almost encounters and stuff like that. And it happened the day they set foot on the ranch when they first bought it. They sold the ranch. Robert Bigelow acquired it, knowing that there was a bunch of weird stuff on it. When they first get to the ranch, all the windows are boarded up and locked up. There's like a bunch of different houses and structures and all sorts of stuff scattered across the ranch. All of them are locked up and boarded up. And it's like, okay, what's going on here? The more they investigate, the more weird stuff starts happening. Robert Bigelow conducts this whole investigation under the U.S. government. I believe at the time under what was called OSAP.
And when was this?
I believe this was like 80s, 90s.
Okay.
Maybe up to the 2000s. And he was doing all sorts of research for the government. Robert Bigelow was also somebody that was intimately involved in aerospace engineering, and also intimately involved in our black budget programs under the United States, which I'd love to touch on that if we have time. He gets what he can out of the ranch, essentially, and tries to wipe his hands of it. He sells it to Brandon Fugel. Brandon Fugel asks him, like, hey, can I have like all your research and stuff that you had from living on this place and researching? He didn't live on it, but from owning this place and researching it for the past couple decades. And he refused to give it to him, told him it was like classified, it was proprietary. And Brandon has had much of the same experiences, minus the government involvement, that Robert had. And it's a fascinating place and fascinating accounts that come out of that.
Can you go there? Like if this is like private property,
super private. They're constantly like conducting investigations and stuff.
That's part of this conspiracy. The government doesn't want you there, so they're not going to let you be there. I mean,
I think part of it would be like a liability thing. Imagine if it was just turned into a theme park and people are getting like chased around by these supernatural just things. Like it would turn into just a lawsuit mess.
You think it's that real there? I mean, you think that?
Yeah.
You think it's that?
Dude, there's accounts that just go back decades. Super reputable accounts, super well documented and well vetted accounts that just do not make sense. Very anomalous.
And so you could just drive there though if you wanted to. You can't.
You can drive like past it.
You can drive past it.
Yeah, it's a big property.
And your car might like float a few inches off the ground as you pass.
Yeah, you might just get zapped.
You might get zapped, and you'll know.
Go into nothing.
Maybe that's the first place to start if we want to see what's really
going on. You might get zapped
on.
into Atlantis or something.
It's here in Utah. We thought it was in Nevada, but there's also some crazy stuff going on out
I'd love to talk about that.
And tell me. Let's actually talk about that, because tell me a little bit. Yeah, about Nevada. Are you thinking like Area 51? And tell me.
So I think a lot of this stuff. So Roswell, famously, and I don't really feel like getting into Roswell. I think people should do their own due diligence looking into Roswell, but not just the mainstream accounts of Roswell. I think you should kind of get into the weeds on Roswell.
What is like the basic mainstream story of that? Like, what do we like? What is the average person?
So what you're gonna find looking into the Roswell story in I'm going to call it like the mainstream, which this is like the more out there approach is also kind of mainstream now. It's not quite just this mainstream dogmatic approach to it nowadays, but essentially what happened outside of Roswell in a place called Corona, New Mexico, around mid-June, early July, there was it sat on a ranch, and this guy found this weird debris on his property. And that was kind of that. He reported to a sheriff. The sheriff passed it up to what was at the time the Army Aviation Branch, which is now our Air Force. They put this guy, Jesse Marcel, on the investigation. He investigates it, finds this weird memory metal, all these weird metals and things whose isotopes just do not make sense to be from this planet, more or less. They come out. The Roswell Army Airfield released a statement claiming that they had found a flying disc and that like we finally captured one, all this stuff, what everybody had been waiting for. And this was about a week after they had kind of found the debris. The next day, the Roswell, basically the newspaper for Roswell came out and said, look, this is what the Air Force just said, who at the time was the Army Aviation Branch, but this is what the Air Force said. We've got a flying saucer, guys. Like, this is crazy. And it blew up. Everybody started buzzing. The next day, Jesse Marcel comes out and goes, wait a minute, guys. That was just a hot air balloon. Doesn't make any sense. So the next day, he comes out, does like this weird photo op with material that was never found on the site of this Mylar balloon, claiming it was from this certain classified project, yada, 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 which has now come out that it was quote unquote Project Mogul, which is like kind of the government doubling down on their conspiracy from the first place. But this memory metal was never explained, and it's popped up again and again in this topic. And it's also something that found its way into the military in all sorts of different applications. And then you have I believe it was his grandson, not his actual son, but Jesse Marcel Jr. was shown evidence that this was definitely something that was completely unexplainable. It absolutely was not a hot air balloon. And he's got a whole account of everything. There's all sorts of conflicting information about it, but that's kind of Roswell in a nutshell. And so the prevailing theory is that the debris from Roswell got sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is in Ohio, which is kind of historically considered like the real sort of Area 51 of things. Supposedly there's this blue room where there's this vault of all these alien artifacts, supposedly bodies and pieces
where's
of
this
craft.
at?
This is in Ohio. It's called Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
So is like the Area 51 that we talk about in Nevada a decoy, and then this is the real one? Or
I think that people just okay, don't get me wrong. I definitely think weird stuff has found its way to Area 51, no doubt. But I don't think it's quite the holding grounds that people think it is. I think the Area 51 definitely probably had, definitely not anymore just because of how popular it's become, definitely had some craft or some pieces of some craft at it that they were using to reverse engineer or attempting to reverse engineer for our, space endeavors, our aerospace endeavors, our fighter planes, all sorts of stuff that we were trying to engineer. And I think that it gets mixed up because you commonly have like the F-117 was built at Area 51. The SR-71 was not built in Area 51, but traveled out to Area 51 to do all its testing.
So do you think that some of the debris or do you think they actually found something that has helped us advance our technology quicker than we would have? Do you
Yes.
do you believe in that whole thing?
Unequivocally, yes.
The technology that we have is because we have found alien technology,
Yes.
and then that has pushed us.
I'm not going to go on record and say this is fact, but there's a very weird coincidence with transistors. There's a very weird coincidence with fiber optics and all sorts of other technology that just doesn't quite fit into the time frame and the story that they kind of talk about how it came to be. So those are like just kind of a few instances of things of that. If you ask me nowadays, where's all that stuff? I would tell you Dugway Proving Grounds right outside of Salt Lake City. And there's a lot of evidence to support that. Supposedly that's where Lockheed Martin is reverse engineering all that stuff. But again, we're kind of getting into the weeds a little bit on this one. So maybe we can kind of circle back to that another time. But
yeah,
Nevada in itself, I don't know that there's a whole lot of weight to Area 51 anymore. I think at a time, yes. And I think a lot of that is attributed to Bob Lazar's story and some of these weird anomalies that people saw around the area, and in all likeliness probably confused them with just some conventional experimental aircraft. But that's not me saying that we are not reverse engineering things and probably don't have possession of things that don't make sense.
Let me ask you this. When you think about the best alien movie of all time, like if you had to choose one alien movie, what's top of the list?
Close Encounters of the Third Kind, far and away.
Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever seen it. I mean, I've definitely heard it. I've heard about it, but
I believe it's a Steven Spielberg movie.
Okay.
I could be messing that up, but I believe it's Spielberg. Fascinating movie. And it seems like he might have known a little bit too much on that. That's all I'm going to say. I think he might have had some help with directing that movie and some of his ideas and stuff, because there's a lot of similarities in that movie that we see modern day that seem to be pretty consistent.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think about this question, like if I had to choose the best alien movie of all time, and we've already mentioned like Men in Black. And
I would not recommend that one for the record.
Well, the one that I'm going to mention isn't as deep either as what you just mentioned. I would say the original Independence Day.
Oh, sure.
Because, you know...
I don't know that they...
Will Smith walking and dragging an alien behind him as he's like yelling and cussing and just... That scene is like one of the scenes from my childhood. So I don't know.
The invasion is a little much.
Yeah.
But I definitely think there's something to be said there. I think that was another one where they might have had a little bit of help.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. What else? I mean, what else do you have for us as far as what have we left unsaid that our listeners need to know?
Sure. I think that a lot of what I'm going to throw at you right now is just things that I find compelling that I think people who are listening should do maybe some background research on, and just if they're curious about this, like some places to go, some people to look into, some programs to look into, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So I've got so much information here. So I'm going to try and parse it out and not hit you with kind of everything all at once.
Yeah. And maybe start out where you think they should start out. So for the skeptic, for the person who's like me, the 5%, we'll call us the 5%ers.
Sure.
Where should they start?
So this is kind of what I tell everybody, because I'm real into this. I try to tell everybody about this. So I'm constantly kind of going down this rabbit hole and trying to get people into this. The first thing I always go to is that first account that we talked about, that USS Nimitz account. Is just fascinating. There's multiple modalities of just accounts from that story. You have eyewitness, you have radar, you have infrared video, you have, I believe there's actual video, but it's not been released. But there's just all sorts of ways to verify that story. And if you listen to David Fravors' account...
let me ask a question. Why wouldn't they release the video if they've already released all this other stuff? Is it because the video would be so conclusive that it would destroy...
No, the common explanation is that... So all the video that comes from this stuff is from the gun pods of these fighter planes. And the conventional explanation, which... I am not somebody in the government trying to tell you this. This is just what they try to tell me. Just putting that out there. Is that they're using these super classified, essentially weapons to like film this stuff in the first place. And to put that footage out would kind of show a hand of what we're capable of doing and some of our more or less classified tech. So that's kind of the conventional explanation. I hate that explanation personally, but that's what they're always throwing in our face about it. So that's a super interesting case. The next most interesting military historical case I would tell people to look into is the Rendlesham Forest incident. And that happened in the UK, at a joint military base. Well, more or less a joint military base. There was an American military base and a British military base side by side. And it almost happened like in the middle of them. There was a touchdown of a craft. Tons of people saw it. And there's some really good evidence behind it. There's a guy that got some weird radiation sickness. I would just compel people to look into that. That's a super interesting one. As far as stuff that's not quite military based, I would look into the aerial school. That's a super interesting case. It was in Zimbabwe. There was a group of kids that were at this private school in Zimbabwe, and they were out on recess, and this craft touches down. Two things get out. telepathically communicate with a bunch of the kids and got back in and left. And these kids immediately recounted their stories. And years later, there was a documentarian that went back and gathered all these kids back up, tried to get their accounts of it, and their stories have not changed at all. And it's interesting because to me, it's compelling because they don't all have quite the same story. It's not like they all got together and tried to like come up with a very compelling story for everybody to listen to. They all have their own little quirks and things that they remember a little bit differently about the story. But the overall, I just say the overall kind of consensus of what happened is pretty consistent. That is super interesting story. Another one is in Virginia, Brazil. There was another documentary about this one, and supposedly a craft crashed in Virginia. This alien or two aliens supposedly got out, were kind of running loose through the city. Tons of people saw them. There's a super weird smell that accompanied this whole thing, which is super consistent with a lot of other stories. It's like this strange ozone kind of sulfur smell that seems to be like mixed with ammonia. That seems to be super consistent in a lot of these like firsthand sightings that people have. But in any case, this craft crashes there in Virginia. Aliens are kind of running around. They're trying to wrangle them up. The military instantly touches ground, kind of shuts down this one airport. There's a group of officers from Virginia that are kind of driving around looking for this thing that they've heard reports of. They see it. One of these guys grabs it, like tackles it, grabs it, gets it in the backseat of their car. They bring it to a hospital. There's x-rays taken of this thing. There's all sorts of like weird tests that they did on it. This doctor will like kind of firsthand account everything that happened, but the government came in, confiscated all the x-rays, confiscated all the evidence of it happening, grabbed the body, and then that night flew it back to the United States, supposedly. Tons of evidence of that whole story. It's super compelling. James Fox did that documentary, and it is absolutely fascinating. I believe that documentary is called Moment of Contact.
Okay.
Super great documentary, super compelling. And the guy that grabbed that alien that I was just talking about, he died like a day or two later. From like this super gnarly radiation sickness, and just like that got taken out. So that's super interesting.
Well, let me ask this real quick. So, and this kind of came to my mind when you're telling me some of these stories, like abductions. Like, does that happen? Is that real? Like, do you have any stories that you believe in that realm?
100%. So this is a very like controversial aspect of this whole, we'll just call it this phenomenon, if you will. And there's a lot of people that have a lot of different opinions on what's what when it comes to the whole abduction thing. There's people that think that absolutely these are just aliens abducting people and messing with them and like tormenting them, yada, yada. There's another group of people who think that this is our actual government more or less psyoping us into believing that they're getting abducted by UFOs, who are using their own reverse engineered UFOs to abduct people. And it's like a whole psyop thing. That's a little out there for me. And the abductions as a whole are honestly a little bit out there for me, but there's two cases that I want to, or actually there's three cases that I'd like to touch on the
abduction.
Yeah.
On the abduction. Yeah.
And I'm not going to get super into them, but if people are curious, they can look up these names. Travis Walton, super compelling case. He was basically a logger. They were out at this logging camp, finished their day. They're driving back into town. He and a group of guys were in this truck. This craft comes out in front of them, bright lights, kind of like shines down. They all stay in the car. He gets out and walks up to it, and everybody's like, dude, what are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. They book it out of there, leave him, and he disappears for days and then pops back up in this city, in this grassy field, just pops back up with this crazy story. And it's wild. I don't know if he's got like radiation burns and all sorts of weird stuff that just don't kind of make sense. And so that's its own story. There's another one, Whitley Strieber. He's a famous author. He's written a couple books about his whole encounter. I don't know much about his story as far as how he got abducted, but he got abducted nonetheless, supposedly, and has a couple implants that don't make sense. Which is its own...
like chips, like, or what do you mean by
Something.
implants?
He's got like I think it's behind his ear or it's behind his knee or something like that. He's got these weird things in his body that are
aren't
completely
normal.
foreign. Yeah,
Okay.
completely foreign. They move around like they're funky. And these have been tested and they're very anomalous. So his case is
Are
very
they like
interesting.
small? Are they?
Yeah, they're pretty small. I haven't seen one firsthand, so I couldn't tell you, but these are all accounts that I've found researching and stuff like that. Written a ton of books. He's been studied. Very interesting cases there. That's Whitley Strieber. And the last one I'll touch on as far as like the whole abduction thing is this case of Betty and Barney Hill. And they were this couple that were driving, and I believe it was upstate New York. They got abducted. Again, I don't remember their entire story because I know way too much about this stuff, and it all gets a little just tossed around in my brain a little bit. But Betty and Barney Hill, fascinating case. It's this couple that's driving, and like I said, I believe upstate New York. They get abducted. They have a super compelling story with some evidence to match. I'm pretty sure they're the case where their car showed like crazy radiation burns on the paint. And if you notice, there's a bit of a theme here that seems to kind of be a little bit anomalous there. So those are a few of the cases that I would say are super kind of stand out as far as the abduction thing. And in that same vein, there's one more thing I want to touch on that's very interesting, and it's this phenomenon of these cattle mutilations. And it was a big phenomenon, and I believe it was the 70s. A couple of famous researchers that went into that. Some of their stuff seemed to be like they were getting psyoped by the government, but some of it was unequivocally very anomalous. And you'd have these cattle that would show up on tons of different ranches all across the United States and in other places too. There's other places in the world that have experienced this phenomenon, but you'd have these cattle where their tongues were cut out with like beyond laser precision. They would be completely drained of blood. They would have organs just like, it almost seemed like just zapped out of existence, like hearts missing with no incisions, with no trace of them ever being removed. Very anomalous. It doesn't make sense. Very well documented.
And they would just find them on their farm?
Yeah.
But it might not even be their cow.
Or
was it usually it was across
branded.
America, but it was like, here's your cow, but no blood, no organs, or wow.
Very strange and very well documented. And like I said, there's a little bit of a psyop that might have gone on with all those accounts, but there's other ones that just absolutely don't make sense.
Let me ask this real quick, because this is a lot, especially for the 5%ers like me. So as a skeptic, I have to ask, how do we separate wishful thinking or conspiracy, theories from credible research? Like, how, as you're doing this, how do we separate that world? Like, how do we distinguish fact from fantasy in this?
Yeah. I think that unfortunately a lot of this stuff is historical and it's hard to at this point. And you just either have to take people at their word and look at their research and go, yeah, that makes sense to me, or no, it doesn't. And this person doesn't seem credible. So there's definitely an aspect to that. But I would also say that modern day, we have a ton of research into this that is unequivocal. And I'll touch on a couple of those because I definitely wanted to touch on those.
Because how do you, it seems like there's got to be a lot of fake stuff out there too. Like people, obviously you get some fame from this, you get attention. I might get a book deal.
Right.
As soon as television came out, it's like I can become famous by sharing the story, or I can be put in the newspaper. I want my name out there. So there is a motivation maybe to want to spread some of this. So just, what do we do with all that? And how do we know what's credible, what's not credible? All of those things.
So I'll touch on a couple like things that I think are 100% credible. And that is stuff that's come straight from our government. We kind of touched on that earlier. Like I said,
I don't know.
Exactly. So like, I find them credible for the reason that they actually brought forth some evidence. They didn't just, talk about some stuff that they think happened kind of deal. So I'm going to hit you with a couple different programs that have been given so much money to research this stuff. It's actually mind blowing. So the first one, OSAP, we touched on that one. Advanced Weapons System Application Program, I believe is what that stands for. So it's AWSAP. That was the one that Robert Bigelow was a part of back in the day. That was like one of our first big kind of advances into this, officially at least. And you have people like Colm Kelleher, and the other one would be ATIP, which is AATIP. That's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. That's a little bit more modern. Also, tons of super credible research that went on with that. We've got one of the more recent programs, which was the UAPTF, which was the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomenon Task Force. And that was headed by Lou Elizondo, who's come out and given a lot of this conversation just a lot of weight. And he's been pretty monumental in this, and I don't put all my faith in him. He's a CIA operative at the end of the day, so I don't quite know how much faith you can put in somebody like that. But he came out, risked his job, risked his career, risked kind of his entire life over this subject. And he's got a lot of super interesting stuff to say about this. You also have people like David Grush, who's another government whistleblower. Again, this guy is even more credible, in my opinion, than Lou Elizondo. David Grush came out. He was in charge of essentially almost auditing the government to a degree, and came across these programs and researched them and kind of blew the whistle on them. And he's a huge reason why this topic is finally in the stage of having some credibility today. There's a couple of other research, I'm going to call them organizations that are non-governmental that I'd like to point people to that are super interesting. The first, probably most credible one in my mind is SOL. And I don't know that it exactly is an acronym, but it's founded by a researcher. His name is Gary Nolan, and he was a biological. He's come up with a couple of different systems that we use modern day for all sorts of different things. He's like a big cancer researcher, and came up with, I believe it's called this mass spectrometry device, essentially, that can analyze different materials and break up the different compounds that make them up. And he's been used by our government, given materials, given samples, biologics, all sorts of strange stuff that he's officially researched. He's not like a government stooge or anything like that. He's not somebody that's paid by the government besides in his contract work. But he's not like a CIA operative. He founded this organization. It's called SOL. And they're doing a lot of important research on this topic and kind of pushing the ball on this whole topic. Another one is called Skywatch. We touched on Jake Barber earlier. Mm-hmm. He's the guy that kind of blew the whistle on that whole psionics thing. He's coming out with this new investigation on this whole psionics aspect of this. They've put out 2 episodes already on YouTube. I'd encourage people to watch that. For the average person, it may not be the most compelling thing. I'll just come out there and say that. It's not like they're going to show you an HD video of a craft, but there's a lot of super interesting stuff going on in that. And to that same vein, I would encourage people to watch the interview that Jake Barber had with Ross Coulthart, kind of just describing his whole experience in that world. So just to give people a little bit of background so they might go and research Jake Barber, because it is so interesting. He's a ex-pilot for the Air Force who was brought on as a helicopter pilot, then essentially like fired under the table and brought back on under the table as like a government contractor who was essentially in charge of retrieving these downed craft. And he didn't just pick up UFOs. This is a guy that picked up our experimental aircraft, all sorts of essentially government secrets that nobody else has privy access to even seeing, let alone picking up with his helicopter. He picked up a few different, what we would call UAPs, and super compelling cases. And he had this weird psionic experience with one, which kind of brought him into this whole psionic world. And he was put in touch with a few other people that are kind of instrumental in that psionic aspect of this phenomenon. And so he's researching super heavy into that. So that, once again, that's Skywatch. I'd encourage people to check that out. There's one more guy, and this is a bit of a controversial name, but I find his stuff super interesting, maybe not super compelling. And to me, a lot of it is, some of it isn't, but his name is Stephen Greer. He's an ex-emergency doctor, got a lot of wild claims. I'm just going to put that out there for people. He's a lot. I will just say that. He is a lot. But he's got this program, DPI, it's Disclosure Project Initiative. And he's put out so much information on this topic. I'm sure mixed in there is some disinformation and some stuff that he's been fed the wrong way. But he's got hundreds of whistleblowers within the government, tons of information about different cases, different sites. He's the reason why I know about the whole Dugway Proving Grounds thing, and that definitely holds some water for me. So I'd encourage people to look into him. And then there's just so many researchers out there. I think one of my favorite researchers for like the layman, my go-to person, if you want to get into this topic, is Richard Dolan. He is incredible. He's a historian. He's not like a ufologist or whatever they're calling themselves nowadays. Super interesting guy. His YouTube channel is fascinating. He's got so many deep dives, so many really great videos and explanations. He's got books. He is, in my mind, the single most credible person on this topic from the outside. And so I definitely encourage people to look into Richard Dolan. He's my favorite when it comes to this topic, and super reputable. There's also a guy, Jesse Michaels, and he's very similar to Richard Dolan, but touches way more on the physics side of all this stuff. So if you're wondering, about electrogravitics and more of the physics behind all this stuff, definitely look into Jesse Michaels. He's super fascinating. And then one last person I'd like to touch on is George Knapp. I kind of already touched on him a little bit, but he's got his own podcast and his own website. Mystery Wire, I believe, is his website, and he's got a podcast with a guy named Jeremy Corbell, who's a filmmaker who's actually instrumental on putting out a lot of those videos that we touched on earlier, between the Tic Tac video, which I encourage people to check out, the Go Fast video, and the Gimbal video. And I would encourage people to check out all three of those. Super fascinating. They're also in charge of getting us some footage off the USS Omaha, which was some night vision footage of these weird triangular objects. And I don't quite know how I feel about them, but I think that the information alone that they put out is definitely credible. So all those people I just listed off are great people if you want to get into this topic. But again, Richard Dolan is kind of my go-to guy when it comes to like really vetting out, like, is this garbage or is this like got some truth behind it? And he's a great resource. He's got a great YouTube channel, a bunch of great books. So yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Shane.
Love it. I mean, more than enough great information to be able to look into, and more than enough research we could do on the topic.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I love to do on this show is to bring people on like you who might have a different perspective, in the world around us than I might have, and to be able to ask questions. And you've done a great job, obviously, doing your research and looking into this and asking some of these questions yourself. And so I think overall for me, it's just a fun topic to look into, and I still have a lot more research I have to do.
Me too.
And, in order to find where I kind of stand on the issue, but this has been an absolutely fun conversation to have. So, Gavin, I just want to thank you for joining me on the show and answering my questions, allowing a skeptic like me to throw some of those questions at you. And you did a great job answering those. Other than that, I just want to say to our listeners, thanks for listening. Until next time, we'll see you on the next episode.